Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.
Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we will be analyzing the important news appearing in the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 26th July 2020. The topics which we will be discussing today are reflected on your screen and the timestamping is provided below. So let's begin. Appears in two parts. First is given on page number 1 titled Gehlot to make fresh push for assembly session amid face-off, and second and the related news is given on page number 7 titled Cabinet Decision Binding on Governor. Now, as you must be knowing, currently there is a face-off going on between Rajasthan's Governor Kalraj Mishra and Rajasthan's Chief Minister Ashok Gehlot. Now, Mr. Gehlot had sent a proposal to the Governor asking him to convene an assembly session so that the Gehlot government can carry out a floor test and prove the majority. Now, Mr. Gehlot had earlier also requested the governor. However, the governor said that the note of the request, which was forwarded by the chief minister, did not explain the urgency or did not even mention the exact agenda for carrying out this assembly session. Further, the governor also wanted certain kind of clarification from the government of the state, asking as to why the session should be convened for a floor test when the government itself is stating that they have a full majority in the house. Hence, in this regard, the Rajasthan chief minister has again sent a fresh proposal to the governor to convene assembly session. Now, this second part, which is appearing on page number 7, is saying that the decision of the cabinet or of the government of a state asking the governor to convene an assembly session is binding on the governor, because summoning, proroguing or convening assembly is not the discretionary power of the governor, and the governor has to act on the advice of the chief minister or as far as this aspect is concerned. Now, having explained the basic issue to you, before we talk about what the Supreme Court had said and what is the legal position as far as this face-off is concerned, I would first want you all to know a little bit about the constitutional position of the governor, specifically vis-a-vis his relationship to the Council of Ministers. Now, the relationship between the governor and the Council of Ministers in a state is very similar to the relationship which is shared between the President and the Union Council of Ministers, which basically means that the governor too has to act on the aid and advice given by the Council of Ministers, except, and the Constitution has very clearly used these words, except in all those cases where the governor is to exercise powers in his own discretion. Hence, the Constitution itself has mentioned that the governor has certain discretionary power. We will talk about that discretionary power in a few minutes. Now, the related constitutional provisions is that Article 163 of the Indian Constitution says that there has to be a Council of Ministers headed by the Chief Minister to aid and advise the governor, except in the cases where he has to act in his discretion. Then subclause 2 of Article 163 says that if any question arises as to the question whether a certain power falls within the governor's discretionary power or not, then in that case, it is the governor only who will have to decide upon this question, and his decision will be final, and anything which is done by the governor in his discretion will not be called into question. Now, without going into details, the very simple reason why the governor has been given such a wide discretionary power is because the governor is basically an agent of the center. He is a liaison between the center and the states. And considering the fact that India has a certain kind of unitary bias, in order to ensure that there remains absolute peace as well as the unity and integrity of India can be maintained, the constitution makers wanted to give certain discretionary powers to the governor so that the governor can carry out his function as the agent of the central government with much more efficiency. Then Article 163 goes on to say that the courts in India are not allowed to inquire into what advice was tendered by the chief minister to the governor. Hence, the discretionary power of the governor is a lot more wider than the president. Then we come down to Article 174. Now, this Article 174 clearly states that the governor shall, from time to time, summon the house or each house of the legislature to meet at such time and place as he think fits, but 6 months shall not intervene between its last sitting in one session and the date appointed for the next session. Second clause says that the governor also has the power to prorogue the house or to even dissolve the legislative assembly. Now, here the constitution is saying that the governor has the power. However, if we read this Article 174 in conjunction to Article 163, it is clearly stating that the governor always has to act on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, except in all those cases where he needs to act in his discretion. So the question in front of us is whether the power of the governor to summon or call for the assembly, whether that power of the governor is a discretionary power or not. And the answer is no. This is not a discretionary power of the governor, and this decision as to when to summon the house is based upon the advice tendered by the Council of Ministers. So here exact issue is this. Though the Ashok Gehlot government has now twice presented the request to the governor to convene an assembly session so that they can prove their majority through a floor test, the governor for some reason is not doing so. Now the second article, which was given on page number 7, in this article a judgment has been mentioned, which is the Nabam Rebia case. Now it is in this case that the Supreme Court clearly pointed out that the governor can summon, prorogue or dissolve the house only on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. Hence, it is not a discretionary power. So, for the prelims, please remember this fact. This fact becomes important. Furthermore, in this case, the court also said that the power, or rather the discretionary power which has been given to the governor under Article 163 is not a general discretionary power, and the governor enjoys only certain kind of limited discretion. And discretionary power doesn't mean that in his own discretion or on his own whims and fancies, the government can act against or without the advice of the Council of Ministers. Now, going a little beyond the scope of the newspaper article, since I did mention the discretionary power, very quickly I am going to tell you the three kinds of discretionary power which the governor enjoys. Now, first is the constitutional discretion. By constitutional discretion, we mean that in the following cases, the Constitution itself mentions that the governor has to exercise certain functions based upon his own discretion, opinion, or independently of the Council of Ministers. Now, this constitutional discretion includes reserving of a bill for consideration of the President under Article 200, Governor's report recommending imposition of governor's rule in a state under Article 356, all the functions which the governor is exercising while he acts as the administrator of an adjoining union territory under Article 239 Clause 2, and then the fourth one is related to the royalty accruing from mineral exploration in Assam. That is not important. But these three, that is reserving the bill, president's rule, as well as administrator of a UT, in all these three situations, the governor has constitutional discretion. Then the governor also has certain kind of special responsibility. Now, special responsibilities have been given under Article 371. Now, in all these cases, though governor technically does consult the Council of Ministers, but in practicality, the end decision is his own because he has to make the final decision based upon his own individual judgment. Now, under Article 73, you have powers like establishing a separate development board for certain areas in Gujarat or Maharashtra, administrating the tribal areas in Assam or hill areas in Manipur, etc. Lastly, we have situational discretion. Situational discretion is all those instances where the Constitution, of course, has not said that the governor has explicit discretion. However, due to certain situations, the governor has been given situational discretion. This includes appointment of the chief minister when no one party has achieved clear-cut majority in the elections. Then the second discretion power is the power to dismiss a ministry which cannot prove the majority in the House. Now, since the Council of Ministers is collectively responsible to the State Legislative Assembly, so therefore, if the Council of Ministers has lost the confidence of the House, but it is not ready to resign, or it is refusing to resign, then in that case, the governor has the power, or rather the situational discretion, to dissolve such a ministry because it has lost the confidence. And third is the dissolution of the State Legislative Assembly. Now here, under Article 174 Clause 2, Subclause B, dissolve the Legislative Assembly. This also the governor does on the aid and advice of the Chief Minister. Now the advice of the Chief Minister, who enjoys majority support in the Assembly to dissolve the House, is normally binding on the governor. However, if a situation arises where the Chief Minister has lost the support, then there were situations where certain governors refused to dissolve the Legislative Assembly on advice of such a Chief Minister. Whereas in certain other situations, some of the governors accepted the advice of the Chief Minister. So this is why it is situational, because it depends upon the discretion of the governor. In usual circumstances, the governor is bound by the advice of the Council of Ministers, CM, the CM specifically, if he says to dissolve the Legislative Assembly. But in a situation where the CM or the ministry themselves are not enjoying the majority and then they say you dissolve the House, then there the governor has the discretion whether he wants to dissolve it or not. So whatever I have explained here, I have attached that in the PDF. Please do not crib about the handwriting. You can get the proper written notes in the PDF itself. With this, let's take up our next news. Now this news appears on page number 10, titled, "Don't Privatize PSBs, Cut Government Stake, Marathi." Now this is going to be a long discussion on whether the PSBs or the public sector banks should be privatized or not. So please brace yourself up. Now, as you must be knowing, as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, the finance minister had recently announced that the government would soon come out with a new public sector enterprise policy. Now, under this policy, the government will notify certain sectors as strategic sectors. And in these strategic sectors, the number of public sector enterprises would be limited to a maximum of 4, and the other public sector enterprises will then be privatized, merged, or brought under the holding companies. Furthermore, all those sectors which will be classified as non-strategic sectors, in that all the existing public sector enterprise will be privatized. Hence, the government is slowly moving towards larger privatization of the economy. Now, presently, based on the media report, there has been speculation that banking sector too may be classified as a strategic sector. Now please remember, this is just what the news reports are saying. No official decision has been taken yet. But if the banking sector is classified as a strategic sector, then that means that effectively government can only own 4 public sector banks. And all the remaining public sector banks, they either have to be privatized or they would have to be merged with the larger PSBs. Hence, in this regard, let us understand the pros and cons of the government's move and decision to privatize the public sector banks. However, to better understand the pros and cons of privatization of the public sector banks, we first need to look at the evolution of the public sector banks or the government's general banking policy in India. Now understand that most of the public sector banks in our country were essentially legacy banks which were established in the colonial period and then were later nationalized. For example, India's largest public sector bank, the State Bank of India, actually began as Bank of Calcutta in the year 1806. Later, it became the Imperial Bank in 1921, and then finally it became State Bank of India and was nationalized in 1955. Then the remaining banks were converted into public sector banks through 2 waves of nationalization. One wave was carried out in 1969 and the other in 1980. In fact, after the 1980 nationalization, public sector banks had 91% share in the national banking market, whereas the remaining 9% was held by the old private banks which were not nationalized. Then in 1991, India brought about the LPG reforms. And this 1991 reforms paved the way for entry of new private banks in our country. In 1993, RBI issued the policy guidelines to facilitate the entry of new private banks on a large scale. And subsequently, this led to entry of large-sized private banks such as HDFC, Axis, ICICI, etc. The second phase was the consolidation and mergers of the public sector banks based on the recommendation of the Narsimham and the PJ Nayak committee. During this phase, the government focused on consolidation or merger of the banks. So, for example, the Mahila Bank plus the associate bank of the SBI were merged into SBI. Then in the year 2018, we had the merger of the Vijay Bank, Dena Bank and Bank of Baroda. Then in the year 2019, 10 public sector banks were merged into 4 larger banks. And now currently in India, we have 12 public sector banks, including the State Bank of India. However, now in the present phase, as per the media reports, the government is working on a proposal to privatize some of the existing public sector banks in accordance with the new public sector enterprise policy. Let us now talk about the present status of the public sector banks in our country. Now, as of March 2019, public sector banks had almost 80 lakh crore in deposit and were giving loan of about 58 lakh crore, accounting almost 70% of market share in the banking sector. However, the performance of these public sector banks has been quite poor as compared to the performance of the new private banks. And this can be seen through the following dimensions. The first and the biggest problem of public sector banks is the higher NPAs. Now, the public sector banks account for almost 80% of the overall NPAs of the banking sector. Furthermore, the NPAs of the public sector bank is around 12% and it is much higher as compared to the non-public banks. In fact, the gross NPA of the public sector banks is around 7 lakh crores, which is again 1.5 times the total money spent by India on creation of infrastructure in 2019. So this figure is basically to put into perspective the higher NPAs of the public sector banks. Now this higher NPAs of the public sector banks then lead to low credit creation. In fact, between the years 2010-19, the annual credit growth of PSBs was hardly around 4%. And this is quite low as compared to the non-public or the private sector banks, which registered a growth ranging almost from 15 to 29%. Then there is this problem of higher losses. In 2019, the cumulative loss of the public sector banks due to these bad loans were around 66,000 crores. And this is almost equal to the budgetary allocation for the primary education in India. Furthermore, the problem of high loss is also due to the fact of higher banking frauds. The PSB account for almost 93% of the entire fraud reported in 2017-18, and this highlights that the public sector banks have poor quality of monitoring and screening. And these higher losses, whether it is in the form of NPA loss or whether it is in the form of banking frauds, essentially where is this money coming from? This is leading to loss of taxpayers' money as well. In fact, the Economic Survey of 2019-20 says that every rupee of the taxpayers' money which is invested in these public sector banks fetches a market value of 71 paise. On the other hand, every rupee which is invested in a non-public sector bank fetches a market value of 3.7 rupees. So this shows that the market value of investment in a non-public sector bank is 5 times as much the value of the rupee which is invested in the public sector bank. Hence, this clearly points to the fact that the taxpayers' money is not being efficiently deployed when it is invested in a public sector bank, and this in turn is leading to the loss both for the government as well as for the taxpayers' money. And in fact, this higher NPAs, this low credit creation, these higher amount of banks fraud and lack of and loss of taxpayers' money, all of this then again lead to lower efficiency in these public sector banks if we compare them to the non-public sector banks. And this lower efficiency is manifested in the form of lower return on capital, lower return on equity, and even through indicators like the capital adequacy ratio. So basic point is that these public sector banks function at a much lower efficiency as compared to the private sector banks. Lastly, all of this, if we club them together and look at the larger picture, all of this eventually does lead to slowdown in the Indian economy, especially during such times where India is already facing a severe slowdown, which again has been augmented due to the COVID-19. So all in all, we can say that the present status of the public sector banks in India is quite dismal. Hence, it is amidst such a situation that a case for privatization of the existing public sector banks has been made out. Let us first look at what are the advantages of privatization of the public sector banks. Now, the government policy of privatization of the existing public sector banks is based on the philosophy that the government should discontinue its engagement in producing goods and services in all those sectors where competitive markets have already emerged. So since in India we have the existence of private sector banks, so there is a competition in the banking sector. Now the enterprises in these sectors, it is felt, are most likely to perform better in the hands of private sector because private sector has various advantages such as it has better technology upgradation, it has efficient management practices, and overall this would create wealth and add to the economic growth of the country. So the first advantage of privatization is that it will improve the overall efficiency of the banking sector in our country. Now, as highlighted before, even though the public sector banks and the non-public sector banks are operating in the same domestic market, the public sector banks are considered to be less efficient, which in turn is leading to the loss of taxpayers' money. Hence, it is expected that if we privatize public sector banks, this will lead to improvement in efficiency of the banking sector as a whole. Second, it is felt that the increased competition will lead to development of large size banks in our country. Now, history has been a testimony to the fact that the development of large economies such as United States of America, Japan, China, etc. has always been supported by large size banks. For example, in the 1980s, Japan had 15 out of the top 25 global banks. And even in the recent years, the economic growth of China has been supported by 4 of its banks, which are considered to be world's 4 largest banks. Now, as far as India is concerned, since 1969, after the first wave of nationalization, India has grown significantly to become the 5th largest economy in the world. However, India's banking sector is disproportionately underdeveloped. India has only one bank in the top 100 banks of the world. And in fact, SBI has been placed at a 55th position at the global level. This highlights the dwarfism of our banking sector when compared to characteristics of our economy. The size of our economy is huge, our economy is developing at a good pace, and even population for that matter. So when we try and compare the size of the banking sector to the size of our economy, it is very disproportionate. Hence, it is felt that privatization will lead to competition, which in turn lead to development of large size banks and will improve the banking sector in our country. Because currently, the government ownership of public sector banks has in a way led to virtual monopoly of the government. Because as I stated earlier, already 70% of the market share of the banking sector is owned by the public sector banks. And this monopoly is reducing the competition, it's breeding inefficiency and is hurting the overall growth of the banking sector in our country. The third reason for such a privatization exercise would be our previous experience. The strategic disinvestment has led to an increase in the overall efficiency gains, which have later translated into higher returns for the shareholders. A good example of this is the approval of strategic disinvestment of the Bharat Petroleum Corporation Limited, which has led to an increase in the value of shareholders' equity. The next advantage is felt that the privatization will help us to better leverage the microfinance institutions and these non-public sector banks for social causes. Because one of the arguments which is being put forth for the continued ownership of government is that through the public sector banks, the government can leverage these banks for socio-economic development. For example, the government has been using the JAM Trinity to target direct transfer of subsidies. Similarly, a large number of government schemes such as the disbursement under the MGNREGA wages again rely on the network of public sector banks. However, it is also highlighted that the government and the RBI can pursue the same even through private banks. One of the best examples in the recent times has been the financial inclusion through the Jan Dhan Yojana. Similarly, in the recent times, most of the private banks have also leveraged the support of microfinance institutions to fulfill their public sector lending requirements. Thus, some banking experts have pointed that it is a myth to consider that the socio-economic goals can only be met through the public sector banks. The fifth advantage is that it will reduce the burden on the government. Now, the privatization of the public sector banks will reduce the financial burden on the government by doing away with the need for undertaking their recapitalization to comply with the higher Basel requirement. And lastly, it is felt that the policy of bank nationalization has in reality not actually benefited the Indian economy. And the argument whether the nationalization has benefited the Indian economy or not has been discussed here. Now, if you look at the arguments which have been tendered to say that the nationalization of banks has had a certain benefit, the first argument is that they feel that nationalization of banks has led to better allocation of the banking resources to rural areas, agriculture, and other priority sectors, and it is this which has caused a significant poverty elevation in India. However, the argument against this is that poverty elevation was not entirely due to nationalization. Other factors such as Green Revolution, launch of poverty elevation programs, etc. too contributed to poverty elevation. Second argument in favor is that they say that there has been a tenfold increase in the number of rural banks in India. However, the counter argument here is that it was not the nationalization, but it was the proactive policies adopted by the RBI to improve our financial inclusion, which has led to better penetration of banks in rural areas. Some of the proactive policies by RBI was the priority sector lending, RBI's 4:1 formula, where every bank had to open 4 rural branches to obtain 1 license to open an urban branch. Third argument in favor of the benefits of nationalization is that it led to 4-fold increase in the agriculture credit post the nationalization. However, here the counter argument is that they say that despite nationalization, even today a significant portion of our poor population remain unbanked. It was only after the Jan Dhan Yojana of 2014 that financial inclusion got the necessary impetus. Hence, the increase in financial inclusion was on account of active involvement of both the public as well as the private sector banks, and not just of the public sector banks. So now that we have seen the advantages or the arguments in favor of privatization, please do not worry if you have missed certain point or were unable to understand. All of this has been written in the PDF. So these were the advantages for privatization. Now let us talk about arguments against privatization of the public sector banks. Now, the first argument against privatization is that a lot of banking experts feel that instead of privatizing the public sector banks, we should try and improve their governance framework. Because there is a need to undertake a detailed and comprehensive analytical study to understand why the public sector banks are performing so poorly as compared to the new private banks. And this would tell us whether the government should actually go for privatization or not. Now, banking experts feel that the real reason for low efficiency is the political interference or political intervention in the working or the functioning of the public sector banks, which in turn leads to lack of autonomy and freedom to these public sector banks and hurts their revenue. So, according to the experts, the solution to improve the efficiency of the public sector banks is not privatization, rather than a complete overhaul of the governance framework. Furthermore, the banking experts say that there are certain other external problems or factors faced by the public sector banks which lead to poor efficiency. Foremost of them is the dual regulation by the Finance Ministry and the RBI. Now, the Finance Ministry's directives can be both explicit through issue of guidelines, or it can also be through informal ways in the form of suasion. However, the private sector banks, on the other hand, are free from such a dual regulation. They are only regulated by RBI and are not obliged to follow the informal regulations of the Finance Ministry. Second problem is of the board constitution. Now, the appointments to the boards of these banks is mainly based on political consideration without giving due emphasis on merit. In fact, the average tenures of the chairman and executive directors of these banks are very short, all of which lead to weak empowerment of boards. Thirdly, it is felt that external vigilance enforcement through the CVC and the CBI also inhibit or discourage these public sector banks from taking any kind of commercial risk. And it is these commercial risks which are otherwise deemed to be very important. The banks need to make profit. Furthermore, there is a higher focus on adhering to the procedures and rules rather than focusing on the outcomes, and this leads to red tapeism and slow decision making. The second argument against privatization is that they say privatization is not a panacea. That is, it will not solve all the problems of the banking sector. Because we have to realize that not all the new private banks are efficient or free from problems. In fact, the balance sheet of some of the existing new private banks is as poor as the public sector banks. Furthermore, it is felt just like the government tries to micromanage the public sector banks, in the private field, the promoters of the private bank try to micromanage these new private banks. And the case in point is the recent crisis of the Yes Bank. Hence, it is felt that it is not the structure of ownership of the bank which determines whether a bank will function efficiently or not, but it is rather the quality of the governance framework and how effective is the regulation which will determine how efficiently the banks work in a country. And accordingly, it is felt that to improve the governance framework and the effective regulation of the public sector banks, the government should implement the recommendation of the PJ Nair committee, where the committee recommended that a banking investment company or BIC should be set up. The committee said that the government should set up BIC in the form of a holding company, and then the government should transfer all of its existing share in the public sector banks to the BIC. So basically, whatever share the government currently has in all the public sector banks, that share of the government will be transferred to this BIC, and then this BIC will act as a trustee and will hold the ownership of all such shares. Now, the main idea behind establishing a BIC was that the governance or the regulation structure of the banking sector in India should be carried out through a hands-off approach, which basically meant that the central government will lay out the broad policy outline. For example, let's say the central government will say that for this financial year, you should record this much of credit growth, or this much profit you should make, something like that. So therefore, the broad policy contours will be laid out by the central government, and then the central government will take its hand off as far as the regulation or interfering in the management or the governance of PSB is concerned. And it is this BIC, that is the banking investment company, which will exercise control over all these public sector banks. It will ensure that all these banks are meeting their targets. It will make appointments to the boards of the bank, ensuring that there is no kind of political interference. However, here please do not get confused. This banking investment company is not going to regulate these public sector banks. Regulation function will still lie with RBI. Only thing which will now happen is that this BIC will ensure that all the broad contours of the policy is being implemented and is being met. Lastly, as a way forward, taking into account both the pros and the cons related to privatization of the public sector banks, it is felt that the government needs to actually follow a evidence-based approach. So currently what the government can do in the short term is that it can privatize some of the medium-sized public sector banks. That is, it can reduce its ownership to below 50%. So if the government does so, then we will have three kind of banks. First will be totally government owned. Second will be banks, public sector banks in which the government enjoys majority stakes. And third will be public sector banks in which the government enjoys minority stakes. Then the government should implement the recommendations of the Narsimham Committee, the PG Nayak Committee, the Rajan Committee, etc. And once the government has implemented their recommendations, then the government should undertake a study to see as to what kind of ownership structure will work the best for our Indian economy. And based upon such evidence, the government should then decide whether to privatize PSBs or not, and whether privatization of PSBs can emerge as a panacea to the present ills affecting the banking sector. So this was all what this article was all about. Lastly, based on the discussion of this article, please try and attempt this mains practice question which will fall under GS paper 3. With this, let's take up our next news. Now this news has been taken from page number 9, titled India-UK A Firm Commitment to an FTA, Early Harvest Deals in Staged Manner. Now the context of the news is that recently India and the United Kingdom have held the virtual meeting of the 14th Joint Economic and Trade Committee meeting. Now during this interaction, both the countries have affirmed their commitment to signing an FTA. Now since this article is a news in transition, since the negotiations have not been launched officially, hence in this regard today we will be understanding some important aspects of FTA which become important from the prelims perspective. Now recently Vaibhav sir had discussed the FTA between European Union and India. There he did cover some of the basics about trade integration. However, today we will be delving into much more detail. Now this discussion of ours is important from the perspective of economy. So today we will be talking about the basics of trade integration. Now trade integration basically refers to the mechanism in which there is free movement of goods, services, investment and people across various countries. Now such a trade integration may take place in several phases depending upon the degree of economic integration between the countries. Now the first phase or the most basic type of a trade integration is a preferential trade agreement or a PTA. Now we first start with a preferential trade agreement. Now please remember that preferential trade agreement is not the beginning of trade integration. We have some other much smaller kind of trade integration as well in the form of partial scope agreement, etc. However, they are too small to be important. So usually PTA or the preferential trade agreement is considered as the first substantial phase of trade integration. Now PTA is an agreement in which the countries decide to reduce the custom duties on certain kind of commonly agreed goods. Now usually the list of goods on which the custom duty is to be reduced is part of a positive list. By positive list here we mean that they create a list in which they specifically say that this XYZ commodity will have a reduced custom duty. Furthermore, in general, PTAs do not cover substantially all trade. And an example of PTA would be the India-Afghanistan Preferential Trade Agreement, which was signed in the year 2003. The second phase is that of Free Trade Agreement or FTA, which is the most commonly used one. Now, FTA is an agreement which can be bilateral, multilateral, regional or even global for that matter. And in this agreement, the countries decide to either reduce or completely eliminate the custom duties on certain commonly agreed goods. Now, usually the list of goods on which the custom duties would not be reduced is part of the negative list. And then whatever goods or services are not mentioned in the negative list, On those goods and services, custom duty has to be eliminated or reduced. So here the difference is, in a PTA, we have a list in which we specify that on these commodities we have to reduce the custom duties. Whereas in an FTA, we have a list in which we include the commodities on which we do not have to reduce or eliminate custom duties, and it is but obvious that whatever goods or commodities is not included in the negative list, on all such goods and commodities we either have to reduce or eliminate the custom duty. Thus, compared to PTA, FTAs are generally more ambitious in coverage of items on which the duty is to be reduced. Now, usually FTAs cover trade in goods or trade in services. However, there are some FTAs which are much more ambitious and comprehensive in nature, and they also can cover certain other aspects such as intellectual property rights, investments, competition policy, etc. Now, this article here mentioned the term early harvest deal. Now, as I stated, in FTA, usually the countries are agreeing to eliminate custom duties. But if you logically think, if any of the member countries all of a sudden, in one instant only, reduce all their custom duties from certain goods and commodities, it will be harmful or detrimental to both the economies. Hence, it is this early harvest phase which is considered as a precursor to the implementation of the full-fledged FTA, and during this early harvest phase, the countries decide to reduce the custom duty in a phased manner. Currently, India and Thailand have an FTA which is under the early harvest phase. Moving ahead, if the countries go further beyond just lower tariffs and kind of give and kind of agree to offer a certain greater package, then that is known as Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, that is CECA, or the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Now, usually both these terms are used interchangeably. However, they do have a slight minute difference between them, but that is very technical and not important from your examination. So, as far as your exam is concerned, you can consider that CECA and CEPA are synonymous. So basically, if the countries go beyond FTA and agree for a greater degree of economic cooperation, that is CECA or CEPA. Now, both these terms describe agreement which consists of an integrated package on various goods, service, investments, intellectual property rights, etc. However, when we say that it has greater economic integration, we mean that in CECA or CEPA, there is also mutual recognition of other countries' local regulatory laws, or rather the domestic regulatory laws. Furthermore, in CECA or CEPA, the countries try to achieve greater economic integration by improving the attractiveness of the capital and human resources into their country, and also try to take measures to expand trade and investment. So the technical details are not that important, but just remember that Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement is one step ahead of a free trade agreement, where in addition to reduction of tariffs and various other kind of mutually agreed agreements on investment, intellectual property rights, etc., where they are offering a certain kind of integrated package, and they are also recognizing the other countries' regulatory laws. An example of India CECA would be India South Korea CEPA, India Japan CEPA, India Malaysia CECA, India ASEAN CECA, etc. Moving ahead, we then have the Customs Union. Now, in Customs Union, the member countries may decide to trade amongst themselves at zero tariffs or at zero custom duty. However, for the rest of the world, they decide upon a common custom duty or an external tariff. Now, example of a custom union is the South African Custom Union. So, the idea here is that all the members of the South African Custom Union may decide that as far as these member countries are concerned, they are going to have zero or very low custom duties on whatever trade they are having amongst themselves. However, for other countries or the rest of the world who are not part of this custom union, they are going to impose a common custom duty. So let's say country A, B, C are part of a custom union and they are trading amongst themselves at zero custom duty. However, let's say for country like US or India, all these three are going to impose, let's say, 10% of custom duties individually as well. So here they have a common custom duty for the rest of the world. Then we have what is known as a common market. Now, the integration provided by a common market is one step deeper than the customs union. And the major feature of a common market is that in addition to having a common customs duty for the rest of the world, a common market has a system where they facilitate free movement of factors of production amongst themselves. Hence, there can be free movement of labor and capital amongst the countries forming part of a common market. So please remember that common market has free movement of factors of production such as labor and capital. Last, we have the economic union. You all know the example of it, which is the European Union. Now, economic union again is a common market which is extended through further harmonization between the various fiscal and monetary policy of the member countries. These countries also agree on same or common currency. For example, the currency for EU is euros. And then these countries and then the members of economic union can also have shared executive, judicial and legislative institutions as well. For example, the EU has a common parliament known as the European Parliament, and the monetary policy of the European Union is implemented through a common central bank known as the European Central Bank. Now, here is a list of all the FTAs India has signed. Now, currently the PTAs in force is that India has a PTA with Asia Pacific, India Afghanistan, India Mercosur and India Chile. Then currently the FTAs in force is currently India has 9 FTAs in force with Sri Lanka, SAARC, Nepal, India Bhutan, India Thailand. As we discussed, it is currently in the early harvest scheme. Then India ASEAN CICA, India South Korea, India Japan, India Malaysia. Now though these are CICA and CIPA, however I have included this within the FTAs only. And the ongoing trade negotiations we have with India EU, India Sri Lanka, India Mauritius, India New Zealand, BIMSTEC, India Iran, etc. Now here I have not included the RCEP because India has clearly denied that it is not going to join RCEP if the terms of this partnership do not change. So since India has clearly refused, I have not included it in the ongoing trade negotiations. With this, let's take up our next news. Now this news has been taken from page number 8 titled Kashmir Saffron now has a GI certificate. Now recently the Kashmiri saffron has been granted the geographical indications tag, ensuring that now the farmers will get the best remunerative price for the Kashmiri saffron. Before we discuss what exactly is the geographical indications tag, let us briefly talk about the Kashmiri saffron. Now saffron cultivation was introduced in Kashmir by the Central Asian immigrants, especially those from Iran, around 1st century BC. And even today, it is Iran which is the largest producer of saffron, followed by India. In our ancient Sanskrit literature, saffron is called as bahukam. Now, as far as what is unique about the Kashmiri saffron is that it is the only saffron in the world which is grown at such a high altitude of 1600 to 1800 meter above the sea level, and it has much longer and thicker stigmas, better color, high aroma, and also has a chemical free processing. Furthermore, the Kashmiri saffron also has high content of crocin, which is responsible for imparting its color. It also has high quantity of saffronal, which is the flavoring agent, and also has high content of picrocrocin, which gives it the bitter flavor. Now in Kashmir, 3 types of saffron are grown, namely Lacha saffron, Mongra saffron or the Guchi saffron. Now in the year 2018, the saffron cultivation was reduced by over 95% due to poor rainfall. However, this year in Pampore, which is considered to be the hub of saffron production in Kashmir, Pampore is expected to have a bumper crop cultivation due to the initiatives taken under the National Mission on Saffron. Now, National Mission on Saffron is an initiative by the central government where they have tried to increase the area under the production of saffron. Further on, now that Kashmiri saffron has got a GI tag, it will enjoy certain benefits including increase in the exports of the Kashmiri saffron. It will have better legal protection. Better and remunerative prices will be given to the farmers. It can also help to stop the adulteration in saffron, etc. Now coming to the next aspect as to what is geographical indications. Now GI tag is part of an industrial property. Just like you have trademarks and copyrights, similarly you have something known as geographical indications. Now this GI tag is that aspect of industrial property which refer to a country or the place where certain commodity has origin. So GI tag is nothing but a tag of the geographical location from where a particular commodity is originating from. For example, in this case Kashmiri saffron, you have Nagpur oranges, you have Sirsiri supari, etc. Now the importance of GI tag lies in the fact that if a commodity has the GI tag, then this GI tag itself is an assurance of the quality and distinctiveness of that product. Because please understand, certain commodities acquire certain kind of uniqueness due to the uniqueness of the geographical place where they have been originating. Hence, certain unique aspect is attributable to the fact that it is originating in certain specific place or in that defined geographical area, then that itself gives us an assurance of its quality and uniqueness. Now, as far as the origin of GI tag is concerned, GI tag has been mentioned as an aspect of intellectual property right under the Paris Convention for Protection of Industrial Property. Furthermore, it has been given protection under the TRIPS agreement of WTO. TRIPS stand for Trade Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, and the TRIPS was finalized as part of the Uruguay round of the GATT negotiations. Now, since India is a member of the WTO, in order to ratify TRIPS, India enacted the Geographical Indications of Good Act in 1999, and it is this Geographical Indications of the Good Act which provides the legal framework for protection of geographical indications in India. Now, as far as the question who grants the GI tag, it is the Registrar of Geographical Indications who grants the GI tag, and this Registrar of Geographical Indication comes under the Controller General of Patents, Design and Trademark under the Department of Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Furthermore, in the year 2018, a direct question was asked which was saying, India enacted the Geographical Indications of Good Act in order to comply with the obligations to, and the right answer is D, WTO, specifically for WTO's TRIPS agreement. So this is all about this news article. With this, let's take up our next news. Now this next news has been taken from page number 12, and it is asking the question whether the SARS-CoV-2 is a latent virus which can reoccur again or not. Now of late, there have been cases of reinfection of the COVID-19 disease, which basically means that people who had recovered and tested negative for COVID-19 were again testing positive after some time. Now the first such trend of reinfection emerged in the East, that is in China and South Korea. And there the scientists were puzzled as to how or why this is happening, that individuals who had tested negative for the COVID-19 were again testing positive for the second time around few days later. Hence, in this discussion, we will be talking about what is a latent viral infection, can latent virus go back into an active phase, and whether SARS-CoV-2 can go into latency or not. Let us first start by understanding what exactly is a latent viral infection. Now, a latent infection is when the virus is lying dormant inside the body of the host and it does not replicate. However, just because the virus is lying dormant doesn't mean it does not have the power or the potential to replicate. It only means for the time being it is not replicating, and in the future it possesses the capacity to be reactivated at some point of time. Now, how is a latent viral infection different from an active viral infection? The difference lies in the fact that in active virus infection, there the virus is actively replicating, and it also has the potential to cause symptoms of that particular infection. However, in the latent infections, many a times the virus is lying dormant, and in fact, for a lot of people, this virus might not get reactivated. However, in latent viral infection, the latent virus gets reactivated if the primary infection is not cleared by the immune system of that person. So if today I have certain infection, I take the medications and I get fine. However, if my immune system has not completely cleared that infection, then that virus can lie dormant in my body and can get reactivated and can replicate in the near future. Now, as far as examples are concerned, the most frequent examples of a latent virus is the herpes simplex virus, the HIV virus, the chickenpox virus, etc. So in all these viruses, what happens is that this virus is present in the cell. However, it is not actively producing more infectious virus particles. For example, when the herpes virus infects a cell, its genome can remain in that cell for as long as that cell is alive, and it might not ever get activated. Similarly, for chickenpox also, after the infection, many a time the body responds and the virus gets into latency. So what happens is that the virus enters the body produces certain kind of immune response, due to which the virus goes into a latency phase. However, decades later, this virus can be reactivated, which can result in shingles on the body. Hence, it will not be the first time that we will encounter a virus which has the potential of being latent and then being reactivated. However, the most pertinent question in front of us is whether this SARS-CoV-2 virus, which has caused the COVID-19 disease, whether this virus can go into latency. Well, the answer can be yes, because a lot of scientists and doctors are of the opinion that all those cases where the patients have again tested positive for the coronavirus might be cases of reactivation rather than reinfection. Now, if you would have been following the news, recently there was also a finding where it said that in the patients who have recovered from the coronavirus, when they were later tested for the antibodies or the immune response, it was found out there that the number of antibodies had reduced in their body, which means that with the prescribed treatment, they were able to control the coronavirus. However, the virus was not completely eliminated from the body and hence has now reactivated. However, there is second thoughts on this matter too, which say that the reason for reinfection or the reason why these people are testing positive again can be attributed for some other reasons as well. The first they say is that it can be a case of false positive, because you know that the RT-PCR test, which is considered as a gold standard for testing, is not 100% accurate. In fact, false positive and false negative results are expected to occur. And we too have come across news where patients are known to test negative, then suddenly they test positive, then again negative in certain days. So they say that the test itself is not 100% accurate and there might be a false positive. Second is the limited detection by the machine. Now you know that there has to be a certain amount of threshold where the virus can be detected by a machine, which basically means that certain minimum level of virus has to be present before the machine can pick it up. So they feel that a negative SARS-CoV-2 test does not mean that there is no infection. All it can mean is that there is no detectable amount of infection. Thirdly, they say is that the lot of viruses, including the SARS-CoV-2 virus, might have the ability to survive outside the lungs at the mucosal level in spite of a person developing immunity. So it is possible that these viruses were surviving outside the lung where they were not able to be eliminated completely and then they are getting reactivated at a later stage. So what exactly is the bottom line? Well, now globally, as far as the procedure for treatment of COVID-19 is concerned, it is now accepted that if presented with clinical symptoms of COVID-19, the treatment of that patient can begin despite the result of RT-PCR test. So based on symptoms only, the treatment can start. Secondly, if the symptoms are withdrawn or the symptoms stop appearing, then that is equated with the person recovering. So if there are no symptoms, it is considered that the person has now recovered. Furthermore, unless the person is very critically ill, it is not necessary that the patient has to test negative for coronavirus twice before they can be discharged or sent home. So this was all about this article. Let's take up our next news. Now this news has been taken in page number 12 and it is with respect to the serological survey which was carried out in Delhi. Now, to estimate the extent of infection in the community, the National Center for Disease Control, which is an organization under the Health Ministry, carried out a district-wise serological survey across Delhi. And the finding of the survey showed that 23.48% of Delhi's population had been exposed to the coronavirus, and that large number of people who were infected were actually asymptomatic. Now coming to the question, what exactly is a serological survey? Well, serological survey is basically a test which is designed to look for the presence of antibodies in the population. Now, as you must be knowing that the RT-PCR test actually looks for antigen or the virus in the sample of the population in order to ascertain the presence of coronavirus or not. However, the seroprevalence survey is designed to look for the presence of antibodies which are in fact produced in response to the coronavirus in the blood. Now, as per health experts, the actual virus, that is the SARS-CoV-2, goes away very quickly in the body, and this is the reason why many a time people who are infected either show very mild symptoms or no symptoms at all. Hence, in a way, testing people for the presence of the antigen itself might not be that effective or if we look for the presence of antibodies, then that is a short test to know that yes, coronavirus was present in that body, because until and unless SARS-CoV-2 virus was there, those particular antibodies would not have been produced. It was found that on an average, antibodies can be detected 5 days after an infection sets in. And the coronavirus usually diminishes after 21 days. Now, antibodies are normally expected to linger for many months and confer protection against fresh infection by the same virus. However, particularly for COVID-19, we do not know till how long the antibodies last in a person's body. But the next question is, how reliable are these serology surveys in reality? Now, usually for any kind of virus or a disease, the routine process is that we carry out antibody tests in order to estimate the prevalence of the disease. However, considering the fact that the COVID-19 has become a pandemic, has spread on a global scale, and we actually do not have much information about the nature of this disease, this has made matter very complicated. Now, usually serological surveys take quite some time to develop before they are actually deployed in the field, and a large number of people are tested. However, this wasn't the case with coronavirus. Due to the sheer magnitude of COVID-19, we had to carry out the serological survey much more earlier. Furthermore, due to the global nature of this pandemic, usually a country would, carry out its own research and make a test which is much more suitable to the population of that country. However, in the case of the serological survey which was carried out in Delhi, we had to use China manufactured antibody kits to gauge the infection spread. With this, we come to an end for today's discussion. Please have a look at the question for the day.